evening, Common Bonds. Good evening, and welcome to the Zoe Rogers Speaker Series. I am filled with anticipation, as I hope you are, because tonight we have two very distinguished and phenomenal gentlemen that would help us to understand a very controversial subject, and that is critical race theory. But first, just a few brief announcements. So as I mentioned, the audio and video will be turned off, and that is to eliminate as many distractions as possible. So please continue to keep your audio muted and your videos off. You should be able to see the speakers. We do encourage your participation, however, and if you have a question throughout the conversation, please use the chat feature, which is located at the bottom. I know many of you are familiar with Zoom, but if you're not, it's at the bottom of the screen, the chat feature. So use the chat feature to ask your questions, and depending on the flow of the conversation, our moderator may address your question during the conversation, or he may address them at the end. And at about 7 p.m., the moderator will wrap things up and then hand him over to Mike, our co-founder, who will close for us. All right, critical race theory. This subject has been the topic of many discussions. It has been misunderstood or has been dismissed for different reasons. And hopefully by the end of our discussion tonight, things may be clearer for you. So let's jump in as I introduce our moderator and our speaker for tonight. I'll begin with Mark Hayes, our moderator. Mark is an Emmy-nominated journalist who spent nearly 3 decades bringing news to viewers in cities including Dallas, Denver, Detroit, and Baltimore. Mark is currently the CEO of his own media training and strategy company. I had the pleasure of meeting Mark a few months ago when Mike sent me his TED Talk and asked me what I thought. After watching it, I was blown away by Mark's story and how he used his personal disappointment to inspire, encourage, and uplift all who will listen. I encourage all of you to watch Mark's TED Talk on YouTube. It's called Parenting with Love for a Better World. And we'll try to put that link in the chat. But again, it's Mark's TED Talk on YouTube, and it's called Parenting with Love for a Better World. I do encourage you to listen. So Mark brings his expertise, his experience, and his passion tonight as we unpack critical race theory. Our speaker tonight is the renowned criminal defense attorney, Temple University professor, and civil rights activist, Michael Coard. Michael brings more than 25 years of state and federal trial experience. He specializes in murder cases and previously worked at the Charles Bowser Law Center after serving as legal counsel for State Senator Hardy Williams. Michael received his degree in law from Ohio State University and his undergraduate degrees in English education and political science from Cheyney University. Michael is an adjunct professor in Afroecology in the African American Studies Department at Temple University, and a volunteer instructor of the Criminal Justice course and a Hip Hop 101 course in the university's Pan-African Studies program. I met Michael Coard the week that Trayvon Martin was killed. That was February 2012, almost 10 years to the day. He was leading a group of activists and concerned citizens in ways to get involved and ways to advocate and fight for change as a result of yet another death of a Black teen. I was among them. I quickly realized then and have seen for the past 10 years, Michael's constant love for humanity, his unapologetic love for his people, and his relentless campaign for justice. Michael has dedicated his life to defending his people. He's the criminal defense attorney. He's dedicated his life to teaching them. He's a professor at Temple, and he's dedicated his life to fight for them. He's a social justice, civil rights leader. Michael is unapologetic and uncompromising in his fight and advocacy for equality and justice for African Americans. And without further ado, I introduce you to Mark Hayes and Michael Coard. I'll turn it over to Mark as the moderator, and he'll present Michael to you. So please sit back, enjoy, have your questions ready, and I'll turn it over to you, Mark.
April, thank you. What an honor and a privilege it is to be here with you and the Common Bonds team. Thank you to yourself again, Michael D. Candido, and of course his lovely daughter who's making this all possible for us, because we're all too old to figure out all this tech stuff. So with that, let's get right into it. I am so excited tonight to talk to Michael Coard, the renowned defense attorney from Philadelphia. Can you guys hear me okay? Yep. Okay, good. And I just wanted to say, you know, as we get started, this is going to be a conversation, right? We're going to get into it and hopefully try to help people understand a little bit better about what critical race theory is. So with Michael, our first question, what is critical race theory? And welcome to you this evening.
First of all, thank you all for having me, Mark. Thank you for introducing me and asking me the most important question of the day. But before I explain what critical race theory is, I need to explain what it's not. But I'm going to be my lawyer thing. I'm going to eventually answer your question after I go around the world 15 times and then come back. But in all seriousness, give me just 2 minutes and I'll answer all of that. And I'm sure my answer will provoke follow-up questions. But let me start out by saying this before I actually get to critical race theory. I mean, we're doing this thing in Black History Month, and it's important that we discuss it during Black History Month, but beyond simply Black History Month. This conversation could be had at any time. I always make sure when I talk to audiences, especially multiracial audience, I want to explain to them that Black history is not slavery. Slavery interrupted Black history, because a lot of folks who are well-meaning think that Black people have this woe is me history and that everything we are comes out of the struggle against slavery. But we're bigger than that. I mean, every anthropologist, Afrocentric, Eurocentric, or otherwise, will explain that humankind happened in Africa, in the Nile Valley region of East Africa, 300,000 years ago. So we're responsible for math and algebra and calculus and monotheism and all that kind of stuff. And I just like to set that stage first so that folks know that when we talk about Black history, we're actually talking about world history. Having said that, when I think about or explain critical race theory, before saying what it is, and I got 37 seconds to tell you what it is after going around the world 15 times, but critical race theory is not Black history. It is not Black Lives Matter. It is not the civil rights struggle. It is not Dr. King. Critical race theory is a concept that grew out of critical legal theory almost 50 years ago. In other words, critical race theory is a law school / lawyer thing, where 46 years ago, one of the greatest law school professors and legal scholars in the world, Professor Derek Bell of Harvard and New York University, came up with this concept where he said, hey, we can debate racial issues, we can debate anything pertaining to race, but if you want to prove the racism of America, you start with its laws, because laws explain exactly what the country is about. You can argue about anything else you want, but when you see the laws in this country begin with the birth of slavery in 1619, you get into the racism of this country. So long story short, Mark, critical race theory is a legal concept to explain how racist the American system is.
Right. So Michael, so when we look at systems and we take a closer look at them, why is that such a problem, and why has it evoked so much anger recently? I mean, we're seeing people fighting at school board meetings. I mean, the most uneventful meetings ever, you're seeing people in fisticuffs. What is it that has incensed people about critical race theory and whether or not it's even being taught K through 12?
And first of all, it's not being taught K through 12 because, again, it's a law school concept. So last time I checked, preschool students weren't dealing with esoteric legal concepts coming out of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. That's the first thing. So it's a law school concept. And the reason why people are upset about what they think it is, they think it's simply Black history. And let's take that as an example. Let's say, for the sake of this discussion, Mark, that it is Black history. Why are folks, and let's be quite candid here. Why is white America so upset about what they think critical race theory is? And the answer is because the truth hurts. That's what it's all about. The truth of what happened to Black folks beginning in 1619 and what America did and what America is doing is painful. And people don't like to experience pain because, like I just said, the truth hurts. And we begin to talk about the reality of what America really is, people don't want to see that. And without getting political, over the past, I'd say 6 years or so, racism in America has become a thing where white America doesn't hide it as much, doesn't apologize as much. You can now say things as an American politician and get away with it that you could think it before 6 years ago, 4 years ago, but now you can say certain things that are acceptable in certain political quarters. So to answer your question directly, Mark, the reason why it's become so controversial is because it's so painful. And the reason why it's so painful is because the truth hurts.
Right. So having said that, Michael, let me follow up there. Because what critical race theory is not, is it does not say that all white people are racist. It does not say that. So the premise from which they bring this anger is wrong.
You know, there are laws in some states, including one that was passed recently in Virginia, that basically say that you can't teach anything in schools that would make white people feel bad. I mean, think about that for a second. You may not teach stuff in school that will make white people feel bad. And that law that they're talking about in Virginia is not just for students in schools, but in the workplace. The idea that we can't discuss America's real history is frightening. But again, Mark, it comes down to the fact that it's true and people don't like the truth. Because if you have to explain, for example, I just attended an event yesterday for President's Day down at the National Constitution Center. And I did my discussion, my lecture about Reconstruction. But that was off to a small room, a small auditorium in Philadelphia's National Constitution Center. In the larger theater was basically red, white, and blue America, talking about the greatness of the founding fathers. Well, this land didn't belong to them. And the idea that at President's Day yesterday at the National Constitution Center, the audiences who came in were bombarded with patriotic nonsense about how the founding fathers had to rise up against Great Britain because the rights of the founding fathers were being violated. Well, look at what the founding fathers and others did to the red people who lived here before. And the idea that America could complain about taxation without representation, which is a bad thing, don't get me wrong, but to complain about taxation without representation, while at the very same time enslaving human beings, is the height of historical hypocrisy. So the anti-critical race theory folks would say, yeah, you can go into that auditorium on President's Day where it talks about the greatness of America, but that little room off to the side where we talk about slavery and what happened to red people, either not talk about it or put it in a small room off to the side. That's the history of America.
Right. So Michael, tell me, let's talk about practical applications now. Why do we even need critical race theory? Why is it necessary to be a part of a legal and a part of academia? Why is it necessary?
A society, a system has to have a structure, and that structure is the law. I mean, for good or for bad, the law basically, it's almost like saying, hey, we're going to play basketball, but there's no rules to the game. So I can grab the ball and punch Mark in the face and then slam dunk. No, I can't do that because that's an offensive foul. So there's got to be certain rules. And the rules of America are the laws of America. So if we look at America's system based on its rules, those rules come out of law. So we look at law and we say, well, what happened on August 25, 1619, where approximately 20 Africans were sold, were sold and leased and given away as property in America? We start that with 1619. It's okay, there were rules to make sure that those 20 or more Angolans who were captured and brought to the Virginia colony on August 25, 1619, that they're not going to be treated like other people. And without getting too far into the weeds, Mark, let me just say this. There are those who make the argument, well, there wasn't any real slavery in 1619 because those Blacks were indentured servants. Well, even that's not true. And that's why it's so important to talk about these things, because we start with slavery in America in 1619, and then we get to 1640. And I'll spend 20 seconds explaining this. There's something called the John Punch case. And the John Punch case involved indentured servants. You had this Black guy, John Punch, who was a quote unquote indentured servant, because to be quite honest, there weren't any real laws per se regarding the Black people. They were brought to this land, but there was nothing written down as to what we do with them, even though as a matter of fact, they were enslaved and held in bondage. So we go from 1619, Mark, to 1640, and you got 3 indentured servants. You got a Black guy named John Punch, and you got 2 white guys. And for those who don't know it, indentured servitude simply means you're bound to a contract for a certain number of years. So you come from England, you get here to the 13 colonies, and you have to work for 10 years to pay off your debt. Well, these 3 persons were indentured servants, but by the time this case gets to court in America in 1640, and these 3 indentured servants basically breached their contract. The 2 white guys said, I don't want to work under this servitude anymore. The Black guys, the same thing. It gets to court, and the court for the first time says, hey, you 2 white guys, you breached that contract. We're going to add 7 more years of servitude on your contract. But you Black guy, John Punch, you are bound to servitude forever. So for the first time, this system, its laws begin to treat Black people unfairly, and that's part of the rules, and that's what we need to understand. Let me fast forward very quickly. 1669 is something called the Casual Killing of Slaves Act. And this law basically says that if you discipline an enslaved Black person and kill that person, you cannot be charged with a crime. There were laws that said, for example, when I wrap this up very quickly, Mark, laws that said that if an enslaved woman, and I don't want to be too graphic, but if an enslaved woman were raped, that enslaved woman couldn't go to the sheriff to get the rapist arrested. That enslaved woman's master couldn't go to the sheriff and get the rapist arrested. That enslaved Black woman couldn't even sue the rapist for the rape. But, and this is the law, the enslaved Black woman's master could sue the rapist for damage to his property. Think about that. These are rules of the game. This is America. And this is what we need to understand about America. And even the founding fathers, you got 56 white male property owners signing the Declaration of Independence. 41 of those 56 were involved in the slave trade. So all of these things are important to understand. And the final thing I'll say, Mark, the final thing, and by the way, I normally tell juries, this is my final point in closing argument, but then I just keep going. But I know time is the essence here, so I will wrap this up. But the final thing I'll say about that is it's really important that to understand the plight of Black people in America, you have to go back to slavery. Because if you don't talk about slavery, then Black people are at the bottom of every category in America in 2020 or 2021 or 2022, because we're genetically predisposed to be at the bottom. So it's either that we're at the bottom, employment, income, education, because we're genetically predisposed, or there's something that happened, and that something is slavery. And after slavery, you got the redemption era. After redemption era, you got sharecropping. After sharecropping, you got convict leasing. After convict leasing, you got Jim Crow. So all those things kept us down. And I always say to people, those who say that I play the race card every time I do a presentation, I say this. I would ask if there's any white person, I have some quote unquote good white friends. Not one white person would voluntarily trade places with any Black person. Income being the same, house being the same, education being the same, wardrobe, cars. How many white people in America today would voluntarily trade places? And as a defense attorney, I always say this: if tomorrow you had to go to court as a defendant in a criminal case, and everything being equal, income, employment, education, car, home, religion, you had to go as a Black defendant or a white defendant, which one would you select? It's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're pulled over by police officers. As the cop approaches you, you could be a white driver or a Black driver. Which would you select? The answer, if people are honest, that answer is obvious. So for all these reasons, we need to understand how Black people got to where we are, and we got to where we are because of the system, the rules of the game that we call the laws of America. And that's why critical race theory is a legal/law school concept.
Right. And so Michael, you said a lot there, but 1619 stands out to me. And I'll tell you why, because Nicole Hannah-Jones, who put that beautiful piece of work together titled the 1619 Project, is now a professor at Howard University, my alma mater. Shout out to the Mecca. But I want to talk about the impact that 1619 Project and the detail with which she laid out how we got to present day Black experience and why it caused so much ire. Because if I look back on history, and I remember to the news cycle, right around the time the 1619 Project came out, we started seeing a whole lot more vitriol and a whole lot more anger and angst directed at Black and brown faces.
And Mark, you're so right on point about that. By the way, Mark, you do this interviewing thing so perfectly. You might want to have a career in this stuff because you do this thing very well. It's so smooth and so fluid, and I really enjoy it. So kudos to you. But you're right. That whole antagonism toward the 1619 Project explains this almost. If you did something horrible in your life, Mark, or I did something horrible in my life, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want other people to talk about it. And if the people have the receipts about the bad stuff Mark did, or the receipts about the bad stuff that Michael did, then we really get defensive because we're being exposed. And what she did was pretty much expose America for what it is by simply, it's almost like she's a surgeon and she sees that lesion and she realized that in order to deal with that lesion, we got to cut out the cancer that causes the lesion. And that's all she's doing. And white America sees this lesion and they're so repulsed by it, but it's their lesion caused by their cancer. Nobody said that any author, whether it's Hannah or any other African senator or Afrocentric or even American scholar, nobody said that what she said was wrong. They simply don't want to talk about it. So if you really want to challenge her and what she's trying to do, say that what she researched and what she discovered was wrong. A prime example, we're taught, yesterday being President's Day, we're taught that George Washington, for example, had wooden teeth. And pretty much everybody's taught that. Well, he didn't have wooden teeth. His teeth were, quote, yanked from the heads of his slaves, unquote. How do we know that? Because we now have access to the dental records and his dentist record showing that. Why is it that I went to a great public school, I went to a great college, I went to a great law school, and it wasn't until a few years ago I found out that George Washington's teeth came from the mouths of my ancestors. How come that kind of stuff is never, ever known? And even the great think tanks, for example, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, that's the George Washington think tank. Anything and everything you want to know about George Washington comes through the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Well, for decades, for centuries, in fact, they denied the story about the teeth. Then all of a sudden, 3 years ago, they finally say, well, yeah, we can see that his teeth were, quote, yanked from the mouths of slaves, as one of his dentists said, but he paid his enslaved laborers for those teeth. That's the position of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So it's incumbent upon real scholars to set the record straight. And even though critical race theory is not what America thinks it is, let's say for the sake of this discussion, Mark, that critical race theory is simply Black history, or let's even call it American history. That truth has to be known. That truth about his teeth, that truth about America, that truth about the founding fathers, that truth about slavery. And I got to just add one quick thing, Mark, in terms of the laws and the rules. And for me, this is telling about America. Many of us know about the Dred Scott decision from 1857, which essentially said that Black people have no rights, that white folks are bound. Look back 1857 and say, oh, that was a long time ago. Where folks would be shocked to know that just about 6 years ago, in 2016, and I would encourage people to Google this in case they don't believe me. It's called Hodes, H-O-D-E-S, versus Kansas Attorney General. It's a 2016 case, and you won't believe this, Mark, because you and I know each other and you trust me. So you believe this. The Kansas Attorney General in 2016 filed a legal brief to support an argument he made in the Kansas Supreme Court. And we lawyers don't just go into court and make an argument. We make an argument, but we cite precedent. We cite cases that support. The Kansas Attorney General in the 2016 Hodes versus Kansas Attorney General case cited the 1857 Dred Scott decision to support his argument. And he did it because although a racist, he was smart. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 has never been overturned by the Supreme Court, never been overturned. And people say, oh, come on, Mike, that's true, but not really true because we had the Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, 15. Yeah, that's true, but that's a congressional act. The Supreme Court itself, like in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896. But there's been no case that has overturned Dred Scott. And the fact that the top lawyer in one of America's 50 states would cite Dred Scott to support his argument in 2016 speaks volumes about America.
Yeah, and when you talk about systems, Michael, the numbers don't lie. As a defense attorney, I can't imagine how frustrating it is to get in court and to deal with some of the cases that you've dealt with. Because I mean, we're seeing so many examples now of, you know, same crime, same circumstance, different sentencing guidelines, options, or opportunities based on your hue. How the law was seemingly created so that everyone could be created equally under the law. Why can't we get to equal justice under the law based on our history? We know that these things are going on. We know how unjust it is. So why aren't we getting to equal justice under the law? It seems like we're going backwards.
It does seem like we're going backwards, and many people see the horrific acts of violence perpetrated against Black people in 2020, 2021, 2022, and they say that, wow, it's getting worse. It's not that it's getting worse, it's getting filmed. That's the thing, it's getting filmed. If this stuff is happening in 2020, 2021, 2022, can you imagine what really happened in 1960? What really happened in 1950? So going back to the point that you raised, Mark, yeah, you see there are similar cases, one person Black, one person white, and the outcome is completely different. Even with the George Floyd case, we see Officer Derek Chauvin doing what he did. But Mark, I'd be lying if I told you that I knew he was going to be found guilty. Think about that. We see this man for 10 minutes, basically strangling somebody to death, and we're not sure what the jury is going to do. That speaks volumes. So the question is, how do we deal with that? We deal with it the same way you deal with any problem. You face it. You know, I have clients as a criminal defense attorney who have done bad things. So we realize that the client did a bad thing. The evidence is overwhelming. What do, Mark? We go into court and we plead guilty. The first thing we do on behalf of my client, yes, Your Honor, my client did have the gun, he'll tell you. My client did rob the person, he'll tell you. And beyond just admitting his wrongdoing, he'll then provide reparations of some sort to the victim. And beyond that, more important, the best apology is changed behavior. So my client admits to the crime, pays restitution to the victim, and promises to never do it again. I wish America were my client. Because if America were my client, I'd have it plead guilty, make restitution, and promise to never do it again. But before we can get to the point of never doing it again, we've got to admit to the wrongdoing. And that's why America is so afraid of critical race theory. Because think about it, this is a law school concept coming out of Harvard. So you know the research is going to be thorough and the results are going to be undeniable. And that classic scene from that classic movie, you can't handle the truth. That's exactly what we got here.
Right. Well, Michael, tell me a little bit about the differences between critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion. We talked a little bit about, where we are in terms of, generational wealth, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a foreign concept of Black families, right? We have family members that die and leave us the bill for the funeral, and that's about it. I think 2050, the estimated net worth of African-American families is going to be $0. Boston Globe did a study in Metro Boston and found that Black families were worth approximately $8 in terms of net worth. Nationally, I think the average is about 10% of white families, 170,000 to about 17,000 for Black families. So, when we think about the monetary aspects of this, I mean, it's systemic all the way around.
It certainly is. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it's all about the system. And it's funny, Mark, because you started to talk about the disparity in wealth and where all that came from. It's really interesting. I wrote an article for the Philadelphia Tribune, and I included this stat. And Mark, you must have read my notes, because that question you posed is right here in the article I wrote. I went through a list of historical dates throughout American history that explain how we are where we are in America today. And this is just one sentence here I have. From 1934 to 1962, this is what happened in America from 1934 to 1962. Modern day white suburbs and Black ghettos were created after the federal government backed $120 billion in home loans exclusively to whites in what's known as redlining. Think about that. From 1934 to 1962, and we're talking about grandparents of today, or in some cases, great-grandparents. So why is it that Michael Coard is growing up in North Philly in a rundown neighborhood? And by the way, I went to a great school at that time, Masterman, in Philadelphia, 70 Spring Garden. And I had a lot of kids who were good friends of mine. But when I would go to their house, I was like, wow, this is like a mansion. When they would come to my house, I'd be embarrassed. And I'm thinking at the time, I'm a kid in elementary school, like, what's wrong with my mother and father? How come they don't live in that neighborhood? How come they don't have that house? But I didn't know about the fact that America, between 1934 and 1952, those kids I went to elementary school with, their parents were or relatives recipients of those $120 billion in home loans, exclusively to Black people. So unless you meet a white person today who is self-made, then the system has made it possible for many to get where they are today. And that's why even the best of white people wouldn't voluntarily trade places with, and I want to be clear, when I talk about white folks, and you kind of alluded to this earlier in our discussion, Mark, I'm clearly not saying that all white people are bad and not saying that all Black people are good, because Clarence Thomas from the Supreme Court is Black and John Brown was white. So that's all I'll say about that. But my point is, I always say that white people ought to do what I as a male should do to stop sexism. What I mean by that is this. I often think that I'm a good person as a man and am not sexist and am not misogynistic because I don't call the women the B word. So because I don't call them the B word, I'm patting myself on the back. Mike, you're a good man. And there are many whites who say, I don't call Black people the N word, so I'm going to pat myself on the back. I need to be more than just not sexist. I have to be anti-sexist. That means I'm not going to use the B word. And when my fraternity brothers do, I'm checking them on it. I'm calling them. White people have to be the very same thing. They can't be not racist. They have to be anti-racist. They have to be able to call their family and friends out on that racism, because if you don't call them out, you're just as bad as me sitting at a party with my frat brothers and they're saying all this horrible stuff. And I'm thinking I'm a nice guy because I'm not saying those things. No, not doing it is not enough. You got to do something about it. Not just not racist, but they got to be anti-racist.
Yeah. And Mike, how do we help people understand that, you know, it's awareness is not a dangerous tool. Awareness, you know, help be better.
Yes.
To understand that we're stronger together. How do we get people to understand that diversity is not a dirty word? Yeah, I was going to say, how do we get people to understand that because I get an opportunity doesn't mean a male somewhere is not going to get one?
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, you hit it on the head. It's all about equal access and equal opportunity. So it's not like saying, hey, I need to get this job and no white person in America ought to get this job. I'm just saying that make sure that job is available to everybody. You know what's interesting, Mark? It seems that now people are talking about their opposition to either affirmative action or quotas or set-asides. And that's interesting because up until the 1960s, Mark, it was affirmative action and set-asides for white people only, primarily white males. So what we're saying now is just to level the playing field. That's the only way we move forward. And can you imagine if America has gotten as far as it's gotten already with technology and all the other kind of stuff? Can you imagine if we open up the doors to Black people, Black men, Black women, brown people, brown women? If America has gotten as far as it's gotten technologically with just white men at the helm, can you imagine we open up the door and make it accessible to everybody?
Right, it would be amazing. Let's talk a little bit more about diversity, equity, and inclusion too, because what's the difference between diversity and creating?
In fact, Mark, if you could just give me 2 seconds, I don't know why, but I'm getting some feedback on my system. Just give me 2 seconds. I think I have a loose connection. Hold on 1 second.
Okay. And in the meantime, folks, if you got your questions, we can start taking a look at those from Michael. Here we go. All right.
1, 2, 3. Are you hearing any feedback, any echo on this end? 1, 2. All right, good, good. Okay, I'm good. Maybe I was just paranoid. I got to tell you, Mark, this conversation is so enlightening. I want to make sure everybody hears it.
Absolutely.
Because if you had just told me, Mark, that you couldn't hear me, I'd be like, okay, let's just start from square one. I'm going to repeat everything I started to say 20 minutes ago, but we're good. We're good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Michael, before we get to our first question, let's talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion and critical race theory. What are the differences in the two? And why do people that go to the office tomorrow not have to worry about critical theory seeping into their cubicle and taking their position?
Great question, Mark. The answer is very simple. Critical race theory is a legal concept that came out of Ivy League law schools to explain racism in the American legal system. That's essentially it. So when you talk about critical race theory, if you have any opposition to it, your opposition has to be at Harvard Law School, at Yale Law School, at Howard. That's where your criticism comes. But then think about how could you possibly complain about legal studies at a law school?
You're right.
You can't argue it anywhere, but if you were, you'd have to argue it in law school. That's the first thing. When we talk about diversity, like I said before, it just makes so much sense. You know, they say 2 heads are better than 1. So in terms of all the great stuff we have in America, you're going to talk about electricity, the light bulb, the telephone, computers, all that stuff. We're primarily talking about white men, but I want to check that. I want to check myself from that, because when we talk about the telephone, for example, when we talk about the light bulb, for example, we give Alexander Graham Bell credit for the telephone. We give Thomas Edison credit for the light bulb, but nobody talks about Lewis Latimer, who was the brains behind both of them. So much so that anytime Thomas Edison would sue people for copyright infringement, he wouldn't go to court to testify. He sent his expert witness, Lewis Latimer, who looked like you or me. So my point is, think about that. You know, one of the problems with racism, I want to get to your diversity, equity, and inclusion. The major problem with racism is that it actually diminishes the potential of a society. Think, for example, about the greatness of Dr. King. What if Dr. King, instead of being a civil rights activist, would have been free to be a brain surgeon? Because he didn't have to worry about, or he could be a scientist and maybe come with the cure to cancer. Many of the great Black people we know throughout American history are considered great because they had to direct all their energy and intellect to defeating racism and slavery. But imagine if they were freed from that cage to just go wherever their intellect took them to go. That doesn't just demean that Black person, it demeans and suppresses America, because we don't have a cure to cancer because Harriet Tubman didn't have the chance to be in the lab because she had to be running through the woods to free people. So going back to your original point, when we talk about critical race theory, we're talking about a legal concept that explains the history of American law. When we talk about diversity, we're simply saying two heads are better than one. Instead of simply having just middle-aged white men doing everything, let's bring other people in to make that more diverse. Talk about inclusion, same kind of thing. Let's bring more people in. And the word I love the most, Mark, is equity, because people often talk about equality, but it should never be equality. It should always be equity. And people think those two words are synonymous. They are not. Equality means you hold me back in shackles from 1619 to 1865. And then you put me at the beginning of the track to run the 100-yard dash against the guy who wasn't shackled from 1619 to 1865. So now that white guy's placed at that starting line, I'm placed at that starting line, and they tell us to run. Why do I lose every race? Because it's got to be better than equality. It has to be equity. So what's equity? Equity is either one, giving me a 50-yard head start, or shackling the competition and making him run the race. So it's not so much about equality, because this is the thing, Mark, equality ignores the past. Equity factors in the past. So that's why it's so important that we promote all concepts of diversity, of inclusion, and equity, because equality isn't enough.
Right, right. So here's a question, and it comes from our discussion this evening. Common Bonds, this amazing organization that we're here with this evening, has a very diverse group of participants and followers. And they would like to know, what can we collectively do, both Blacks and white, to talk about working collaboratively and bridging the gap together?
Well, first of all, Mark, I would defer to April and Mike in terms of what Common Bonds can do, but I got to give Common Bonds a big shout out for inviting me to speak. You know, it's funny because I do a radio show here in Philadelphia, TV show, I write for the Tribune, and I'm known locally as the angriest Black man in America. And people don't know how to interpret that, but it comes from paraphrasing what James Baldwin said when he said, to be Black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage. So if you know about America's past and present, you got to be angry about it, but not a destructive anger. It has to be a constructive anger where people like you and me, we speak. But Mark, what's so important, I got to give April and Mark and Common Bonds a big shout out for this. You have to have that difficult discussion with the people who might find it uncomfortable. Because Mark and Mike simply talk to Black people and Mike simply talks to white people, then we never cross paths. So we get to a situation where we have this kind of discussion, and I'm sure it's uncomfortable for some people. I'm sure it's even painful for some people, but we either do that or we remain as is. So again, Mark, I give you credit for doing this thing so smoothly and so fluently. You make it so that nobody feels uncomfortable, especially me. So I got to thank you for that, Mark.
Quite welcome. You're quite welcome. But it's a difficult topic, and it's a conversation, you know, that we have to have. I mean, my son plays professional hockey, right? So imagine the conversations that we had to have as he was growing up, because I didn't want him to go into that space with fear and waiting for the pulled out from under him. I wanted him to be confident. I wanted him to be his authentic self and understand that while you may look different, you know, not everybody's going to see you as a Black hockey player. You're going to be a hockey player at some point. Just be a hockey player.
I got to tell you, Mark, that's a great example, because I would have made a mistake. I don't have any children, but if I had a son, I got to tell you, Mark, if he had told me he wanted to play hockey, I would have gently redirected him toward basketball.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, you're a great athlete. And if you really want to get into the game and have a chance to make the pros, this is the only path you have. You use the phrase authentic self. That's the perfect phrase, Mark, because what if my son was a better skater than a dribbler? I'm not going to let him skate because I'm like, you're not going to get the opportunities that you deserve. You're not going, because hockey leagues and teams are not diverse. They don't promote equity, and they're certainly not inclusive, but basketball teams do. So I would have directed him toward that. He would have been another Michael Jordan or LeBron James, I'm sure of that, but he wouldn't have been his authentic self. And that's the perfect phrase, that you got to be in a position of being your authentic self. And discussions like this help promote that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you very quickly, I want to turn the tables on you. Why didn't you try to redirect him to basketball or something like that?
Well, I'm married to a young lady from Queens, and she doesn't play. So she told me to take. but I never realized how much I enjoyed watching him play. And you watch them grow, and
Yes.
it was, Michael, it was almost addictive.
Wow.
You know, my oldest son played football, and I really enjoyed that. But you know, I enjoyed seeing my kids smile, and when they were in their happy place, I was happy. So that's why I didn't push him in other directions, and because I thought about it, and I wanted to, you know, because I wanted to help. I can't help you with hockey.
Yes.
Daddy doesn't think about
it.
right, and I wanted him to be in an environment where there were other kids that looked like him, and there just weren't. And you know, it's interesting too, on the team, he plays for the Atlanta Gladiators, which is minor pro hockey now. The other African-American on the team was actually his teammate in prep school.
Wow.
So that's all, you know, the numbers are, you know, in hockey, but he still loves it. He still grinds. And as long as he's passionate about it, I'm happy.
Wow.
So that, it put me in my happy place.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah. But, you know, I wanted to ask you about our young people, because it seems like if there is to be a savior of the Republic, it's going to be our young people. They embrace more. They're open to new ideas and concepts. Why are our young people, you know, so open to understanding and acceptance of others?
You know, as old as I am, I'm probably the nerdiest hip hop scholar and soldier you could ever. So there's a lot we can blame hip hop for, but one of the things that we can give hip hop credit for is that it's brought young people together.
Yeah.
It's brought and I don't even want to just call it a musical genre. It's almost like a culture for young people, where it's not just the music, but it's the language, it's the dress, it's the attitude. And you see Black hip hop artists, you see white hip hop artists, you see brown hip hop artists, and you begin to see even Asian hip hop artists. And they're coming together in that craft. And by the way, I just want to say this. Most of the hip hop you hear and see on radio and TV today is pure garbage, pure trash. And I always tell people, don't blame the garbage that you see and hear that claims hip hop no more than you should blame jazz for Kenny G. If you tell me that you hate jazz, tell me you hate Charlie Parker. You'd be crazy. Tell me you hate Miles Davis. You'd be crazy. But if you say you hate Kenny G and therefore you hate jazz, I'm like, but Kenny G ain't jazz. So you hate that garbage that claims to be jazz, and much of the stuff you see and hear on radio and TV, which claims to be hip hop, is not. Hip hop is basically an updated version of the Harlem Renaissance to a beat. And I'm talking about groups like Public Enemy and Dead Prez, and even more recently, J. Cole and Kendrick Lamar and The Roots. I'm talking about poets who use that poetry in a rhythmic way. And I think young people have begun to embrace that. So if there's any one thing that has brought the younger generation closer together, I'd say it's hip hop. And I teach hip hop class, but Mark, I got to tell you, it's painful for me to have to listen to some of the garbage that's out today in order to intelligently discuss it. Like, and it's funny because a lot of people say that, well, yeah, every generation hates the newer generation's music. But I'm like, no, I hate it because it's garbage. You got to put a subject and verb together. Even if it's profanity, even if it's obscenity, it's got to be poetry to a beat. And that grunting and mumbling and nonsensical stuff is just horrible. But to answer your question, young people are being exposed to a different thing. Say what you want about hip hop, to a certain extent negative. Say what you want about social media, to a certain extent negative. But there's a kernel of truth and goodness in both of those. So young people have access to hip hop, access to social media, and those who want good stuff can find it there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So before I let you go, Michael, I want to ask you if I wanted to go out and do something. First of all, if I wanted to go do something, what can I do to help people get a better understanding of CRT and some of the finer points that we've discussed tonight? But also, where can I go and where can I direct people to information? And because if you tell them to get on the Google machine, they'll go down a rabbit hole.
Yes.
Here.
Yes.
But where are the sources that we can go to that we trust, like the Library of Congress?
Yes,
Where can we go we can trust and say, you know what, this is where you get the information that matters?
Great question. And the answer is, and I'm going to do a bit of self-promotion here. I write a column for the Philadelphia Tribune, and I try to write about race-based topics. And I write in the way that my mentor, Malcolm X, would always say, make it plain. So if you're a lawyer talking about the law, don't talk like a lawyer, make it plain. If you're a historian talking about history, don't talk like you're some esoteric historian, make it plain. So I write these weekly columns in the Philadelphia Tribune, and these columns are called Freedom's Journal. So every Sunday I talk about stuff, and the article that really blew up was an article I wrote about critical race theory. So I would encourage people just to read as a starting point, and I include references in it as a starting point, the Philadelphia Tribune at phillytrib.com under my name, Michael Coard. And that takes you directly to what you want, because you made a good point about what we call the Google machine. If I say Google critical race theory, you'll be sent in a million bad directions. So I would encourage people to read anything written in the Philadelphia Tribune by me about critical race theory and race issues, specifically regarding critical race theory. If they want to get really deep into it, read anything. The seminal article about critical race theory is in the 1976 Yale Law Journal, an article written by Professor Derek Bell. So if somebody wants to be really scholarly and intellectual, just find that 1976 Yale Law Journal article by Professor Derek Bell. More recently, there's a person who is basically a student of sorts of Professor Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw. And Kimberly Crenshaw, she's the scholar who took Derek Bell's critical legal theory, because when it was first born, Derek Bell in 1976 called it critical legal theory. More recently, another law school professor, a sister by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw, she changed it from critical legal theory to what we have now, critical race theory. So my stuff in the Tribune, the 1976 article by Professor Derek Bell, or more recent scholarly articles by Kimberly Crenshaw. That'll get you started. And after that, you can go down that rabbit hole that Mark talked about.
Yeah, Michael, I mean, it's funny too, because people will say, well, I read it on the internet, so it must be true.
Amen. Amen.
The same thing applies to critical race theory.
Yes.
Michael says that he's going to share that article again for you folks who are online with us tonight and would like to see that. So we'll put it up on his social media feeds, I'm sure, as well. Well, Michael, this has been an enlightening and an incredible discussion. I hope you and I can continue to have future dialogue along with Common Bonds and continue to open the eyes of folks to the Black experience, of course, to what it is and what it is not, just like we did today with CRT. Why don't you leave us with a couple of parting thoughts?
Thank you. And by the way, I thought, and I was incorrect, this was going to be like a 6-hour discussion you and I were going to have tonight. I read it wrong. That 6 was actually a 1. So that's cool, because I had like, I don't know, 50 pages of notes I wanted to go over. But let me just thank you, Mark, because you make this thing so fluid, so natural. I knew that when April and Mike asked me to do it, that it wasn't going to be stuffy and stilted and formal, and you're the guy they said you were. So I wanted to commend you for that. My parting thoughts, and again, big shout out to April and to Mike and the Common Bonds in general. My parting thought is this. You started out by asking pretty much, why is America so antagonistic toward critical race theory? And my answer is because the truth hurts and America doesn't want to deal with the truth. But we need, just like we need men of goodwill to speak out against sexism and misogyny, we need white people of goodwill to speak out against racism. And people say, well, what actually is racism? You know what racism is. You know what you wouldn't want to happen to you if you were Black. You know why you wouldn't choose to be Black as a defendant if you could choose not to be. You know why you wouldn't be a Black driver if you could choose not to be when the cop pulls you over. So if you don't know anything else about racism, that's it. So starting out with that point, do whatever you can to undermine racism, speak out against it, call out your coworker, call out your pastor, call out white folks you're around. You know, it's interesting because a lot of times good, well-intentioned white people will come to me and volunteer to donate to organizations that I'm a part of, to come speak at events. And I'm like, I respect you for that, I appreciate that. But a better thing than to coming to me and other Black people and telling us what's wrong about racism, you need to tell white people about it. You need to have those conversations at your golf courses. You need to have those conversations at your country clubs. You need to have those conversations at your churches, your mosques, your synagogues. So my parting thought is simply this: in order to address and effectively resolve the issue of racism, you got to admit what my clients admit to when they plead guilty. One, you have to admit that you did something wrong, or if you didn't do anything wrong, you allowed wrong to take place around you. So you plead guilty for what you did, of what you allowed to happen. You make restitution to the victim, and you can decide what that restitution is, and then you make sure you never do it again. So my parting comment, Mark, is be my client who pleads guilty to a crime and wants to do the right thing now.
All right, Michael Coard. Oh, wow. What an amazing conversation, my friend. Thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate you.
And like I said, Mark, you might want to go into this whole TV thing. You're good at it.
Thanks again, my friend. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks. You as well. Michael?
Great. Well, Michael and Mark, tremendous appreciation. And Michael, to be quite honest with you, I could listen to you for 6 hours. This was just a fabulous conversation. A couple of things in concluding. One is, Michael and Mark, we'll have to hire you guys to be our PR folks for Common Bonds, because, as you were talking and I was looking at our mission and action statement, everything you've mentioned is part of our action. And the one big thing we have on our website that I want to point out from our action, which I think really came out in this conversation, is the hope that everyone will join addressing the issues we have and be a voice for helping drive fairness and equity in our society. And Michael, you put it perfectly. We need to talk about it, and the truth has to be known. And what we try to do at Common Bonds is really really help folks focus on being in an environment that we can have the uncomfortable conversations in a respectful manner. And I think this was wonderfully direct and wonderfully collaborative, and greatly appreciate your passion for the topic, as well as you sharing your knowledge and history on it. Hopefully we can continue to dialogue with you now and in the future. And the other thing I love about these sessions, and clearly today, is it's very difficult to have an interactive session when you don't have people on video and audio. but I love the chat and I love the
Yes.
feedback in the chat, and all of you really, the passion that all of you show. One of the things I'm proud of from a Common Bonds perspective, two things. One is the learning I get every day from April. And she's a great teacher and mentor to me about the shoes she walks in every day,
Yes.
and the perception she brings to the table, and how I have to learn and continue to learn because my lens doesn't see or doesn't experience what her lens does. And secondly, I love our followers. I love the people who've joined this conversation and can see the leadership that you all display in the chat that we've done and the comments that you've made. And I'd ask you to take and heed Michael's advice of being a leader, bringing up issues when they come up. So Michael, thank you so much. And Mark, for people who don't know, Mark and I go way back. We actually played high school basketball together.
He told me that. Let me ask you this. Who was better? He said he would score 50 points anytime he played against you in scrimmage games.
Anytime we say we played, I said, I always enjoyed watching Mark play basketball. But Mark and I got reconnected by a fellow high school colleague, and I'm so blessed that we have. And we asked Mark to do this, and Michael pointed out on numerous occasions, Mark is an expert. Mark is
thank you.
A professional who has a wonderful experiences and wonderful success. And we couldn't be more blessed, Mark, to have you conduct this conversation. Hope both of you will continue to be followers of Common Bonds and support us, and we'll continue to support your messages as well.
Absolutely.
And I appreciate you saying that, Mike. That's really important. It's so funny because Mark and I actually didn't know each other, but in the hip hop community, there's this saying, game recognizes game. And he and I spoke for maybe 3 minutes to prepare for this. He started talking out, he's like nothing else to say. See, yeah. It was that easy. So yeah, game does recognize game. Yes.
Yeah, so it's wonderful. So really appreciate everybody joining. We did record this, so we'll provide it in the next couple of days, on our YouTube site. And we'd ask you guys to continue to join our Common Bond sessions. We have another fantastic real-time topic next month on voting policy.
Yes.
And the challenges of gerrymandering and those types of things, where we'll have some experts explain that as well, and the importance of us all understanding what that is and what we have to do about it. But again, Michael and Mark, bless you. Thank you so much for joining us, for sharing openly in the dialogue. All of you, thanks for joining us. Please continue to share and feel free to share the recording. The more we can get the message and mission out to people, to talk about it and have the truth be known, is what our goal is. So with that, we'll leave all of you, and thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it. Have a good night.
Thank you all.
Great night. Thank you all.